Hello again. Continuing on with my talks about face rigging, I've been focusing primarily on a joint-driven system that relies on NURBS surface constraints to direct the joints so that we get, use something, this brow should be fairly extreme, so we get a joint movement that rolls along a skull rather than moving very linearly. Um, so far I've talked about how to set that up. I've talked a little bit about how we might create additional control by making some on the face controls which allow for additional deformation. I've talked a little bit about sliders, not too much about that though. And I've talked about how to do corrective blend shapes like this here I used for a corner out shape. Most recently, I talked a little bit about one idea for creating a sticky lip solution, and now I wanted to talk about the issue of squash and stretch. So I should start out by saying that if your intention is to create a realistic head, you're not going to have some extreme cartoony squash and stretch. Um, Rather, you're going to end up with something more realistic. So uh, if you open your own jaw, right, you'll see all of this area here is very rigid. This is the bottom of your jaw. What does stretch, or squash rather, is, oh yeah, I guess, yeah, stretch, is this area right here, this soft, fleshy area. So um, it's pretty easy for you then, right? I mean, really all you're going to do is take this and maybe move it in some, maybe even, fiddle around with some joints around here some. Maybe, pull your cheek down a little bit, even this a little bit here. Things like that. Um, and that's going to give you basically what you'd expect to see in a more realistic head. And then, you can do the reverse, that when you close this lip tight, um, your jaw is pushing all this fleshy area and bunching it up. So, you get less of a concave look here, and everything starts to, you could, really push that if you wanted to, and sort of, in reverse here. This might push up a little bit, and not so much this area, but we'll squeeze it a little bit. So, that's essentially what you would expect to see. If you're doing something more animated, more cartoony, then you're going to want something a little more extreme. Um, Not too long ago, I was tasked with figuring out a way to create character variation by scaling joints. Um, as say, you could have a guy and you could, sit there with your little sliders when you start up the game, and you could thin out his face or thicken up parts of his face, make his brows more robust. That quickly became a bit of a challenge because you can only have one skeleton, and that skeleton has to not only animate the face, but you want it to be able to create variation as well. So you could, only use scale channels if you wanted, and I don't have the scales hooked up here. Whereas your rotation and translation would be in control of actually doing the lip sync and such. You could use the scale channels um, to deal with creating your variation. Um, Also, you had access to something like the head and even the jaw joints, right? Where you could scale those in and scale them up, maybe move them a little bit, do some different things with that. Yeah, so but you don't really get fantastic results. You can get pretty creative, and you could even have joints that live above these joints in the chain, which could be in charge of moving the lip sync or the facial animation joints around to create variation, and you could scale those and stuff, and then still have your animation joints sitting on top, somewhat unaffected by all of that. But if you're doing something more cinematic, or if you have the type of engine that allows for any sort of blend shape, or I'm sorry, I'm just trying to work while I remember terminology. But if you have anything that allows for any sort of blend shape in your engine, or if you're doing cinematic work and you can use whatever, then I would probably suggest actually sculpting out a shape. Here I have a copy of this head. I haven't done anything to it. I haven't frozen transforms or anything like that, so it's a nice solid copy. What I would probably do is give this a name, and we might call that, I've been naming everything male head. We could call it like squash, stretch, target, right? We'll take that target. We could duplicate that once. Move that up here. And we could duplicate it a second time. And then we go ahead and name this like, squash underscore shape. And then we call this one, stretch underscore shape. There we go. And we can take both of these and move this out of the way again. Create another blend shape out of that. Right, so let's see. Here, this is what I call this. This is going to be my stretch shape. We could call it even just head stretch in case we end up with something else, something like that. Doing in between, advanced, just leave it at default for now. We can always edit that later if we need to. And then we create this a blend shape from this head, and we call that head squash. Right? And then finally, we'd take this guy, and we'd take our render head down here, and we could call this squash stretch shape, something like that. And I think I need this to be parallel actually, because I've got a few shapes going in here now. There we go. So what I'll do is I'll run through here real quick, and I'll bring the channel box over so you can see what I'm doing. But here you see all these inputs into my final render mesh, and we should see our squash and stretch shape. Let's go ahead and crank that all the way up to 1. And then over here, we're going to see something similar. Here's head squash, head stretch. So we'll work on the squash shape, and I'll leave the stretch up to you guys. So I just crank that up to 1. So now, when we take our squash shape mesh here, and we start squashing it, that'll update on here. So what don't we want to do? We definitely don't want to grab this and just start doing this to it, because I'm not going to get much of an effect off of that. We definitely want to edit this on the component level. We don't really want to do this to it, because we're getting the whole head and neck and everything. So we can use some of Maya's other tools. We could use a lattice in this case. Here we could use a soft modification tool if we wanted to. Just put that in there, and I'll show you a little bit about this tool. There we go. So what this does is let you move this around and then increase the radius of this, like that. And usually I'll just grab this in a regular, let's see, component mode. So I'm sorry, and just see, now that didn't really work out for me. Sorry about that. Quick pause here while I just had to make a new handle. What I actually did in this case was I selected the entire mesh and then turned on the soft mod tool. So move this guy around a little bit, do this here. I might increase or decrease the radius. And then you see here, I'm just over in the channel box editing the scale values of that soft mod handle. And you see we can do all kinds of fun stuff now, right? But to get a squash shape, really what you're trying to do is scale it down in Y. Geez, so maybe, we could say Y is going to be 0.8. We could even make it more extreme just for purposes of demonstration. And let me just pull this out for you. So yeah, I put the scale to 0.7. And let me just show you this real quick. So if you watch what's happening, and we'll do 0.6, it's even more extreme. The chin actually raised up a little bit, and that's not really what squash is going to do. So I would probably try to move the head back down a bit just to compensate for that. There, well, and then since we put 0.6 in here, usually the way I do squash instructions, I'll say, okay, well, I subtracted 4 from Y. I have 2 other channels, so I want to add 2 to each of those. So 1.2, 1.2, and that's just sort of a nice mathematical way of making sure you retain some volume there. And again, this probably doesn't look as great as it could. A couple reasons for that. One is that we're dealing with not the best head ever, but something that is designed to look more realistic. And also because a head just doesn't, you wouldn't want to just squash it like that. Normally you'd want to see something where it might get a little thicker in the middle, and it's sort of doing that now, a little thicker, and it tapers off and that sort of thing. So that said, we'll just show you one other way you might want to consider doing this, and that is with a lattice. So we'll create a deformer lattice, and really you could go in here and hand sculpt, per verts if you really wanted to. Here I have 2, 3, and 2 on X, Y, and Z. Yeah, I think that's what I used last time, so we'll give that a try. Yeah, so here's our lattice. And you know what? The problem with that would be that it's going to squash the whole head, so we'll maybe just select the verts we want. Apply that lattice again. Okay, so then we can just select lattice points. This is a little easier than going around and trying to pull this around vert by vert, when really all you're trying to do is maintain the character, but just squash his head. So there we go. So then we'll pull these out. We'll make it really extreme just for fun. There we go. And the bottom I might not affect too much for a few reasons. One is it's gonna, you might even, see it's affecting the neck and stuff. I don't really want to do that too much. I can pull these up, and then of course I'd probably grab this whole thing and kind of pull those down. Maybe scale the whole thing out a little more this way, But yeah. Fortunately, my job is not to be the modeler, right? But you can get a lot of good stuff going on there. Yeah. And you see now that is affecting this here. You still have this lattice on here if you need it, in case you want to edit that later. And we go the whole way back down to this guy here, and you see that's carrying the whole way through. But we're still getting, our nice jaw opening. It's going to be hard to see my on the face controls here, sorry, but select a couple of these here, and we'll still get our lip behaving the way we expect to. It's going to look a little off, obviously, because things are moving around, but still basically where I left everything, right? And even the brow is going to still function fairly well there. So, there you go. One option for squash and stretch. I hope that helps you out. And we'll talk to you next time.